There is something deeply powerful about beliefs that are repeated over generations. The more they are heard, the more they feel like unquestionable truth. Over time, they settle into the human mind so firmly that people rarely stop to ask where they came from. When it comes to Jesus Christ, this effect becomes even stronger. His name carries centuries of emotion, devotion, and identity. But hidden beneath all of that is a question that very few people take the time to ask. How much of what we believe about him actually comes from him? If you begin to explore this question honestly, something unexpected starts to happen. You begin to separate what Jesus actually taught from what was later said about him. And in that process, you don't lose meaning, you gain clarity. Because sometimes the truth is not what has been repeated the most, but what has been quietly overlooked. One of the most widespread assumptions is that Jesus clearly and directly claimed to be God in a literal sense. For many people, this feels like the foundation of everything. It's seen as obvious, unquestionable, and central. But when you look carefully at the earliest records of his words, that direct claim is not presented in a simple, unmistakable way. You don't find a moment where he plainly says, "I am God, worship me." Instead, what you find is something far more subtle and layered. Jesus often spoke in parables, in symbolic expressions, in language that invited reflection rather than forced conclusions. He frequently referred to himself as the Son of Man, a phrase that highlights his human role and connection to humanity. Yes, the term Son of God appears, but in the historical context of that time, it carried meanings that were broader than what many assume today. It could refer to someone chosen by God, someone spiritually close, or someone carrying a divine responsibility, not necessarily God himself in a literal sense. Over time, interpretations of these titles began to change. Debates emerged. Different groups understood his nature in different ways. And eventually, these discussions led to formal decisions, such as those made during the Council of Nicaea, where religious leaders attempted to define who Jesus was in precise theological terms. This tells us something important. The understanding of Jesus as God in the way it is commonly expressed today developed over time. It was shaped through interpretation, not delivered as a simple, direct statement from his own mouth. Another assumption that feels almost unquestionable is that Jesus came to establish a completely new religion. Today, the existence of Christianity as a global faith makes this seem obvious, but history tells a more complex story. Jesus lived within his own religious tradition. He spoke to his own community. His teachings were not about creating something entirely new, but about correcting what had gone wrong. He emphasized sincerity over ritual. He challenged hypocrisy. He spoke against those who used religion for status, control, or personal gain. His message was a call to return to something pure and authentic, a direct relationship with God built on humility, compassion, and truth. This is very different from founding a new system.
Religion happened gradually. As his message spread beyond its original audience, it was interpreted through different cultural and philosophical lenses. Figures like Paul the Apostle played a major role in shaping how those teachings were presented to the wider world. Over time, what began as a movement of reform became a distinct identity, but that identity was formed after Jesus, not clearly defined by him. Then there is the idea that Jesus taught passive weakness, that he encouraged people to accept zulm, injustice, and suffering without resistance. This interpretation often comes from phrases like "turn the other cheek," which, when taken at face value, can sound like surrender, but context changes everything. In the culture of that time, such a response could actually be a form of quiet defiance. It was not about accepting oppression, but about refusing to respond in a way that continues the cycle of violence. It was about maintaining dignity without becoming what you oppose. And when you look at his actions, the idea of passivity becomes even harder to accept. Jesus spoke boldly against corruption. He challenged powerful figures. He exposed hypocrisy in ways that were uncomfortable and even dangerous. This was not the behavior of someone promoting silence or weakness. It was the behavior of someone who understood the cost of truth and chose it anyway. Another misconception is that Jesus rejected worldly life completely. that he encouraged people to detach from society and abandon everything material. But his life shows the opposite. He was present among people. He attended gatherings. He shared meals. He interacted with individuals from every part of society, including those who were often ignored or rejected. His teachings did not call for isolation. They called for transformation. The problem in his message was not the world itself, but how people lived within it. He warned against greed, against becoming consumed by material desires, but he did not say that life itself should be abandoned. Instead, he emphasized living with purpose, with akhlaq, with a sense of responsibility toward others. There is also a tendency to reduce his message to simple kindness, to see him as someone who only spoke about love in a soft, comforting way. While love and mercy are central to his teachings, they are not the whole picture. His message also included accountability. It included truth, even when that truth was difficult to hear. He did not hesitate to confront those who misused their authority. He spoke strongly against those who turned religion into a tool for control. This shows that his version of love was not passive. It was active, demanding, and sometimes uncomfortable. It required honesty. It required courage. Another idea that has become deeply rooted is that belief alone is enough, that simply claiming faith is sufficient, regardless of how one lives. But when you listen closely to his teachings, there is a consistent emphasis on actions, on how people treat one another, on whether they help the weak, feed the hungry, forgive those who wrong them. For Jesus, faith was not just something spoken, it was something lived. It was visible in behavior. It was reflected in choices. The idea that faith can exist without responsibility does not align with the message he consistently delivered. And finally, there is the assumption that everything attributed to Jesus today comes directly from him without change. This is where history becomes important. His teachings were passed down over time, first through memory and oral transmission, and later through written texts. In this process, interpretation naturally plays a role. Different communities understood his message in different ways. Language differences, cultural influences, and historical circumstances all shaped how his words were recorded and preserved. This does not mean the message is lost, but it does mean that understanding requires effort. It requires tefekkur, reflection, and a willingness to look beyond surface-level assumptions. When you step back and look at all of this, something becomes clear. The image of Jesus Christ that many people hold today is not just based on his teachings. It is a combination of his teachings and everything that came after. And this realization is not meant to create doubt. It is meant to create awareness. Because when you begin to separate the original message from later additions, you start to see something deeper, something more consistent, something more human, yet more powerful. You begin to see a message centered on sincerity, on compassion, on justice, on humility. A message that does not depend on complex definitions or labels, but on how a person lives their life. And perhaps the most important part of this realization is what it demands from you. Because once you begin to understand the message more clearly, it is no longer just an idea, it becomes a responsibility. It asks you to look at your own actions, your own intentions, your own treatment of others. It asks you not just to believe, but to live. And in that moment, the focus shifts. It is no longer about what has been said about Jesus over centuries. It becomes about what his message is asking from you right now. Not in theory, but in reality.